Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Design and Dialogue. I'm Glenn Adamson, co-host of the program, and really pleased to have you joining us today for a conversation with Jonathan Trayte, joining us from London. Just a few announcements before we begin. First of all, let us know where you are zooming in from, if you don't mind, in the chat, and also put any questions that you might have for Jonathan in the chat as we speak. We'll get back to them at the end of the hour. Also, do be aware that we are muting everyone just to preserve audio quality. So as I say, the best way to get our attention is to just put any comments that you have in the chat. And the recording will, of course, as always, be put on our archive on Friedman Benda's webpage, so you can always watch again later. Jonathan, welcome to the program. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you're in lockdown London.
Yeah, well, south of London, in the countryside. Yeah.
Right. And we're already getting a little bit of a glimpse of your world there on the wall behind you. And
yeah.
If you don't mind, I'm actually going to jump right into images because we have a lot to look at together. So one of the things that I first was very struck by when visiting your studio for the first time was this profusion of objects and images that you keep around you. And I wonder if you could just kick off by talking a little bit about that, about the range of visual stimuli in your practice and what that gives you.
Yeah, I worked for a time as a chef, and it led to an interest in food packaging and the way things are presented to consumers. And my wife's an American, and my father's lived overseas for most of my life, so I've traveled quite a bit, and wherever I go, I collect food packaging because what interests me are the discrepancies in like different cultural interpretations. What orange might mean to an American is different to something from the Middle East, for example.
Yeah, I noticed you also said the way that things are presented to consumers. So another thing that strikes me about packaging is that it's also got a very strong rhetorical quality and a very strong sense of artificiality. And as we can see, in that can of mango slices and syrup, for example, you see the fruit presented not as a real thing or as an actuality, but as a kind of ideal or cartoon in a way. And I wonder if that's also an important aspect of this as a visual repertoire for you.
It definitely is. There's a lot of these influences come from the natural world, but they've been synthesized and transformed to something completely different. And it's that transformation that I find fascinating.
Yeah, so here's another shot of your wall, and I think here we see or begin to see the range. So it's obviously not just packaging, it's also material samples, it's photography, natural world, it's design history as well. So it's quite a rich stew that you're bringing together. I see Noguchi's Gemini gel down there, for example, on the lower left. So can you describe the kind of intuitive process that you're undertaking when building this visual world? And then maybe a little bit about what it actually gives you as a designer.
Well, what you're seeing here on the wall and what was in my office behind me is just a collection of things that I've seen, either online via Instagram. Actually is like a great wealth of visual information. I learn a lot just from other people's posts, posts about design history or art history. And but there are also things that I found whilst cycling through the Pyrenees with my brother, or out on a coastal walk. I found something on the beach. So I just have a few places where I pin things to the wall that as source material. And obviously when you come and take a picture, it's visually exciting because everything's mashed up together. But sometimes when I'm working on an artwork, I have like quite a clear idea of how it's coming together, but sometimes it needs like another thing. And this is where I'll go to try and to glean some kind of inspiration, or maybe it's a reference to like Noguchi, like you say, or it could just be like a weird sign that I saw on a tree in France.
So it's almost like a quarry that you can pick through and pluck something out of and add it to the work. It's also interesting to me that this wall, or the wall that's behind you, looks like and also unlike a Google image search. It has that sense of an array pure visuality, or Instagram, as you said. So it's got a kind of quasi-digital aspect to it, but then it also has this very material quality and also a variation and sort of bewildering complexity that no Google image search actually would have, because that's algorithmically
impossible
in one direction. Yeah, exactly. So
yeah.
you never get this on a digitized algorithmic logical pathway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just one more page of these references. These, I take it, are mostly or maybe entirely your own photos. Is that right?
There's a few here. Yeah, mainly. There's a couple of shots here, like the Tangerine House. I don't even know where that is, but that's something I saw online, and obviously it's wonderful. And then the frozen. I can't even describe it. There's an image there at the top right that I saw at this. When was it? I can't remember. Milan. That was it. Sorry, the design fair in the museum. So yeah, mainly my photographs on travels. So bottom right is traveling through the Rockies. The weird coniferous tree with multiple limbs, that was taken in the south of France on a holiday, just in someone's backyard. So there's just all sorts of different references.
Yeah.
Cholla cacti from Joshua Tree, and then top right there's Palisades. This is Palisades is just, it was on a journey that we took, and we just pulled off the highway to stretch our legs in the morning, and found this enormous rock face of just unimaginable beauty. It was fantastic. Really, really good discovery.
Yeah, so there's a lot of chance encounters, sort of adventitious aesthetics going on here.
Yeah.
But another thing that really strikes me about it is the fluidity between the natural and the artificial. Like that Tangerine House, somebody, as you say, deserves a gold star for that, for sure. But
Yeah.
also, it's like you're finding these moments in nature that themselves look almost designed, like that hand-like tree that's right above the Tangerine House,
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Yeah.
with skeletal hand, or
Mm-hmm.
just the strange bulbous qualities of cacti or plants. Reminds me a little bit of like 19th century botanical illustrations by Ernst Haeckel and other people like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Found that artificial genius out there in nature.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I want to ask you whether the natural to the artificial feels like a spectrum to you that's mutually imbricated rather than a direct opposition, as we often might think about it.
Yes, I've never really actually considered that, but I definitely feel that it is. I mean, it's all as one. It's kind of the same thing, like a sliding scale, as you say.
Mm.
And for me, it's really exciting to take references from either end of the spectrum and put them together, because they are inextricably linked. We are natural. We're everything around us, whether we've made it or whether it came directly from nature. And that idea of nature. It's all one and the same.
Yeah, I saw a good quote yesterday when thinking about this interview that said something along the lines of, instead of thinking about nature versus culture, we should just admit to ourselves that there are some parts of nature we're more interested in than others.
Yeah.
And that's how that's what culture actually is.
Yeah.
Just one last studio shot before we get into the chronological flow of the work. I really love these two images that you just sent me together, precisely because of what we've just been talking about. Like that object on the right seems sort of fruit-like, also maybe refers to kind of various decorative traditions, maybe a little bit of beach ball, a little bit of Art Deco. And then you what looked to me like very practical sort of, studio infrastructure objects on the left. And yet it does seem like there's a conversation going on between them, between the kind of mechanical and the organic.
Yeah. The studio is definitely functional. It's a functional space that's kept, clean, and everything has a place. Like you see on the left, I'm kind of obsessive about, things have wheels so they can move around, and they have a place, just so I know where they are when I need them, but also they're kept out of the way so they don't get damaged or, just covered in paint or whatever. But these photos were taken by my good friend, John Hooper. So these are another artist's snapshots of my creative space. And it's interesting, you know, having a photographer come into the studio, because they see some of the things that you take for granted or you overlook. Yeah, so
I guess this would also be a good moment to talk about the fact that you are a maker of incredible range and prodigious skill. I'll just say that you don't have to. Can you just give a very brief sort of CV of yourself as a maker? So you've obviously worked for other artists. That's been a big part of your background, and also, as you said, as a chef. But what's the overall picture of the materials and processes that you're using?
Well, so I did just a conventional BA degree in fine art. We learned the basics about materials, you know, woodworking, welding, a little bit of welding, a bit of ceramics. But I came away with very little actual practical experience, just because of the way the course was structured and how much they had to cram in. So instead of, you know, on graduating, instead of, you know, keenly pursuing exhibiting work, I decided that I would rather actually equip myself with skills. So I had to support myself. So I first worked as a chef for a few years, and then I worked for a stonemason. I then worked for Gary Hume I did a year's work for him, but with a stonemason, Kim Merridew, who's also an artist, and he taught me everything he knows about stone, which was, you know, a baptism of fire, but it was really, really rewarding. And then to AB Fine Art Foundry, where I worked for 10 years, putting together huge projects, sometimes small things, you know, small commissions for galleries, but then also, you know, like Trafalgar Square, Fourth Plinth stuff. We did the nail, Gavin Turk's nail that went outside St. Paul's Cathedral, which, you know, it's a simple gesture, but it's just monumental. It's vast. It's, you know, it's a huge endeavor to put together, to weld and chase. And so all the while I'm learning skills, and it's come to a point now where I have finally got a workshop where I can actually put things of significant size together on my own, you know, my own work, which is just really exciting. It's
well, let's step back a few years before we get to that point of having the present studio opportunities that you do now, because my impression is that when you first started establishing yourself as an independent designer, you were using those skills, but there was also a kind of small scale experimentalism that you were almost obligated to use. And I wonder if you could just talk about those first years, the exhibition opportunities that you did have, and starting to find your own voice as a designer.
Yeah, well, I studied at the Royal Academy of Arts, and these pieces here, then they weren't made during my studies, but these are in a similar vein to the pieces I made graduating. These are bronze casts that I'd made on the shop floor in, you know, spare hours between paid work. And the foundry there, and Jerry Hughes at the foundry, you know, was really generous. He supported me, and he allowed me to use the materials and the tools for a fee. And so this is in that vein, but with the ability to weld and to work stone, you know, I just experimented with everything. And yeah, I guess we'll go on to talk about it, but like the cafe that we built, that was my first real kind of foray into making some furniture. But these pieces are bronze casts of fruits and vegetables, and they're painted with like auto paints. So they're highly processed paints that are painted in layers, multiple. Like the bottom one is probably painted with four or five layers, varying colors with a clear coat. So it's like, technically they're quite complicated to finish, but they have this kind of simplicity, this kind of like pop-like effect, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, you can definitely see the influence of the packaging coming through, and of course fruits themselves, which often have those kind of unearthly colors, especially as we encounter them in contemporary supermarkets where they've been full of chemicals and sent around the world at odd seasons. But also, I think that word pop makes me think about pop art and the legacy of commodity related sculpture. And I feel like that's surely an important source for you as well, the idea that an artwork can engage with the domain of commodities whilst also setting itself apart to some extent? Because I guess you're making a commodity as well as commenting on others, right?
Yeah, well, I think so. The reason that I started making these, it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek jab at the environment at the Royal Academy, because the Academy is, unlike most university, it's privately funded. So we had a lot of patrons that would come around. You know, of course, it's fantastic to get that exposure, but also the schools is based in the heart of Mayfair. So to get to college in your like plastic covered trousers and your worn out t-shirt on your push bike, you're going past like Gucci and Prada, all these storefronts just like dripping in money. So like, when you see it every single day, it kind of it makes you feel a little awkward. And these were made in response. They're kind of like, they were supposed to be baubles, but to be like ridiculous and frivolous and playful. So that's kind of where it came about. So they are intended to be commodities.
I love that, Jonathan, because it also, rather like you working at after hours at AB Foundry, it also sort of paints the portrait of you as somebody who's on the margins of this kind of hyper commodification that we always talk about in the art world, but not necessarily being actually a part of it. Certainly not at that stage as you were first capturing yourself. So there's a real psychological quality there that I really love, like almost pressing your nose against the glass.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here we start to get into your environments, which we'll see quite a few of. So this one, obviously, as people can see, from 2015. Can you just talk about how you started to get from the scale of a single object to the enclosure, to the envelope of an installation?
Yeah, so the previous artworks that you'd seen, they'd kind of led me down a path where I was just focus on making objects, and small objects at that. You know, they're not huge pieces, or they weren't large then. And I'd kind of got to a position where curators and galleries that were showing interest were only really interested in those objects because they were saleable. You know, a lot of them had been, well, all of them had been sold and gone to collections. So it kind of generated an appetite, and it just got a bit frustrating. You know, I was really happy that the work was getting seen and it was being sold occasionally, but it didn't give me the room to experiment. And so I applied for the Converse Days and was shortlisted. And we got a really small fee to just put together a show of our own. And this was in a 2-story space that doesn't exist anymore. It was at the back of the Royal Academy. And I built this peculiar kind of storefront, this like shop space, and I threw everything at it. I experimented with wallpapers. We built a whole stage, which you can see there, and exhibited, you know, different pieces of work in all manner of materials. I just threw everything at it. So it was really exciting. It was a good project to do.
And you also included that found object, a propane heater. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's actually been worked. It's cut open on the bottom. It was intended to be part of another artwork in place of a functioning cylinder, just for exhibition purposes, because you can't have flammable materials in the museum space. So that has been worked and painted, but it is a found object. Yeah. So it's kind of put in there.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask you about that because it seems like, I mean, sometimes the experience of your work is I'm not sure if anything is a found object or not.
Yeah.
Which is a super interesting state of mind to be in, because we're used to the idea of the Duchampian found object as issuing a pretty clear challenge to the notion of skilled fabrication. You have this kind of skilled found object versus the hand wrought artwork. And
almost as criticism.
Yeah, you're creating a kind of blur zone between them sometimes, it seems to me.
Yeah. I kind of feel like there's no hierarchy, and you know, everything's fair game. And why limit yourself? You know, as an artist, I think that is the beauty of being an artist, that you can do or use anything. You know, and there's no like line in the sand, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet the creation of each individual element has tremendous kind of frictional specificity to it, right? So there's that kind of infinite freedom, but when you make the gesture, you have to be all in and totally committed. I definitely feel that dynamic from So here we have that cafe that you mentioned before, Milk, which makes me, I don't know if you thought about this, but it makes me think of Clockwork Orange, the Milk Bar in Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, yeah, there's definitely a nod to that. Yeah.
The Moloko Cafe, yeah. So yeah, tell us about this, because this is an important project, not only because it's another of these key installations, but also because it necessitated you interacting with functionality and kind of service culture in a different way.
Yeah. This was again a project that I put myself forward for. It was for Royal Academy graduates to collaborate with fashion designers from the fashion industry in London, and I was paired with Kit Neal, who's a menswear designer. He likes to use like really edgy prints, bright colors, lots of textiles, and he loves for things to clash. So when they were putting the designers and artists together, they thought we'd make a good pairing, and we just hit it off. We had a really fun time and experimented a lot. They gave us a tiny amount of money really, and wanted us to create one object that would then be sold at auction to raise funds for the project and to go in towards the next year's collaborations. But Kit and I really didn't want it to just make one thing that would then be sold and just go into a private collection and never be seen. We wanted to make something that had, that was an experience that any passerby could participate in and potentially take something away. So with my experience of metalworking and the stone, and Kit's experience he's worked with Lavazza before, sponsored, like a fashion project. So he sweet talked Lavazza to supply the coffee. We persuaded Christie's to let us use the cafe space, and we just totally transformed it. And then made all of these furniture pieces for people to use. So it actually became a functioning cafe for 2 weeks during the exhibition.
The palette is so interesting too. It's that millennial pink color that was just 2016, right? But it seems like a big step forward for you in terms of color, because of the sort of intense, I keep using the word artificiality, but it really fits here. The sense that these are not the colors of nature, that you're sort of stepping into this sweet shop kind of, it is almost like a digital, paint shopped space that you're in, even though it's also physical.
Yeah, and also, it's the first time I really embraced using stone in my own work. And whilst there are some really vivid hues in natural stone, they're not as vivid as paint. So we tried our best to kind of lift everything, create contrast, and that's why we decided on the wall colors and the divides partway through the wall. Yeah,
that's really interesting, Jonathan, because it shows that the dynamics we were talking about earlier, that nature culture thing, that actually becomes operationalized when you start thinking about palette and material selection. So you have to think about something like synthetic paint colors and natural stone colors, and how you're going to work with them together. Yeah. Can you tell me about this project, Polyculture, because this is not one I know as much about. So is this another one of these kind of pop-up exhibition projects?
No, this was an invitation to show at the Tetley in Leeds, which is a museum. So this is my first museum show, and they had quite a short turnaround because the then director, Bryony Bond, had only just taken her post, and she'd inherited like a program that had some gaps in it, and she just discovered my work. So she asked to come and see me, and we had 3 months to prepare for the exhibition, which isn't enough really when you think of the size of the space. And it also, it was slightly compromised for me as an artist because of the parquet floor and the oak paneling. It's a fabulous space, but they're old office buildings, and so this kind of affects how the work's seen, but it also soaks up a lot of natural light. And so the piece on the left, well, both of them have light features, but the piece on the left was one of the painted bronze sculptures, as you can see. But I decided to put this light feature on to kind of lift it, to punctuate the space. And that's the first of the lamps that I've been making since. So it was kind of a real breakthrough for me.
I was going to ask you actually at some point, this is a good time, about lighting, because it's not actually a field that a lot of designers enter that readily because it's got a kind of technical quality, and of course it comes with a lot of apparatus. We had Michael Anastasiades on the program a little while ago, and he's opposite. He's plunged very deeply into it and sort of fully absorbed what lighting can be as a kind of technology, formally speaking. And it seems to me that your use of lighting, well, it's about as different from Anastasiades as it could be, but you nonetheless are often making a really strong gestural feature of the bulb and the kind of exposure of the mechanism of the lighting. And I wonder if you would just talk about why you were interested in going into that particular subfield of design and what it's doing for you.
Well, I guess for me personally, I think of light as a material, just as the paint is, the concrete, the bronze, the way in which it creates illumination and affects the environment around it is just as important for me as the materials in the sculpture itself. Also, well, nowadays I have to consider using LED lighting just because, for energy efficiency, but also it just means that more options are available for international exhibitions. But what initially drew me to using lights was the incandescent bulb and the temporality of its life. I guess for me, and this is something a friend of mine, Roy Voss, once told me. He also uses light bulbs, but just thinking about the temporary nature of the element and the fact that, it just goes. And that's just a perfect metaphor for life. That's it just makes me think about our own temporary existence and our frivolous, lives. That's like a snapshot on the earth. So yeah, that's why I like using them.
So it's almost like you're giving the piece a soul by putting the light in there.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. Or an opportunity for us to reflect on our own soul, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and in fact, there is a kind of anthropomorphism in a lot of the work. Perhaps not so much these two, but there's often a kind of upright, ungainly, human-like scale to them.
Yeah.
And they also often suggest perhaps equipment for some undisclosed purpose.
Yeah.
Which makes me want to ask you about, this is a kind of, almost an inevitable topic that comes up in the field of contemporary design, but about functionality and the way that you're using ideas of use expressively in the work. Lighting is lighting, but when you go to an object like the one on the right, you might well ask yourself what it's for, if anything.
Yeah, definitely. So this show was an opportunity to make things that outside of my comfort zone, to experiment. The piece on the right was one of a few pieces that referenced kind of like supermarket equipment, things like traveling in the States. I would be fascinated with the weird, product stands that you'd find at Stop and Shop, or like I don't know, like in a like food factory. I did a lot of research in food factories in the UK, and they have all of this stainless steel equipment that gets wheeled in and out of kilns and ovens for like just putting glazes on ham or whatever. I've got thousands of pictures of this kind of stuff. So I wanted to refer to that. But also at this point, I'm still just making sculpture. And so for me, there's a slight frustration in that, these objects, whilst they're really interesting, the piece on the left, well, they're really interesting to make, and there's lots of different things referenced here. I think, maybe unwittingly, there's a frustration that it's not really actually functional. And so the piece on the right is like just an attempt at expressing this frustration, and hence its absurdity. It's completely useless. It's ungainly, impractical, and there's this painted bronze like thing hanging off the left-hand side. So this is I think an important part just before I actually started making things with real function, which was liberating.
That's brilliant. So it's another spectrum, isn't it? It's from the kind of straightforwardly useful to the totally fantastical. And then there's this kind of this is something that pops up in the work over and over again, the presence of these kind of cast-offs, or just sort of weird, eerie ghost-like presences in the exhibitions that you tend to dot things around.
Yeah, these are casts from, they are, as you say, rejects. These are the leftovers from vegetable competitions. And there's a culture here in the UK. You have it in the States too, but I befriended a few growers who they tend to be old men who've retired from engineering or whatever, and they've got nothing better to do, so they devote their time to feeding vegetable plants just crazy concoctions of feed to create these outrageous, like ungainly vegetables. So occasionally, I'll in the autumn I'll go and visit them and I'll see what they've got going, and something that's just, it looks good, or it's big and voluminous, but it's not heavy enough to win the competition, and they'll just say, yeah, you can take it. So these are casts from that, and they just feel like weird characters sat around watching the show.
Yeah, exactly. It might be worth just underlining for the viewers that when you say you're casting these, that's not a figure of speech. You're actually taking them back to your studio and working with them to pull them and cast them. So you actually have them around the actual physical things as well, and they sometimes decay and change.
So I would have to transport them to the workshop. Some I'd get in the summertime, others in the autumn. But the thing I told you about in the Q&A was, molding the melons. That happens to the marrows too. When you're doing making the molds, you got to do the silicon, and then you got to do plaster. And as the plaster heats up, it warms the fruit and it ferments. And then you've got to flip it over and do all the other side. Meanwhile, this thing is still fermenting. And I tell you, when a marrow goes, it goes overnight and it just turns to soup. And you'll find it like running down the trestles, down the corner of the room. It's just disgusting.
Yeah, forget about light bulbs as a metaphor of mortality. That's, but there's also something here about a kind of British eccentricity that I feel motivated to ask you about. It reminds me a little bit of like the Detectorists, or Jeremy Deller's, the TV show The Detectorists, or Jeremy Deller's exploration of folk. There's a sense in which you're summoning the kind of wacky, adorable, yet also slightly unnerving underbelly of British culture here. I don't know if you would agree to that, but how it strikes me.
Definitely, but probably unwittingly. I'm sure it's just around me and I feel it. It's the kinds of jokes that my friends make. I think it's in our sensibility, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's wholly intentional. It just kind of creeps into the work.
Yeah, well, it's in you somehow, right?
Yeah.
So speaking of lighting, here's a really great set of examples. And here, we have to think perhaps about the palette developing from that sort of more, the sort of initial tentative explorations into something that's extremely bold and gutsy and kind of electric in every sense. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how your work was developing at this point, 2017, 18, into a more expressive.
Yeah, sure. So this Polyculture show was a really important stage for me. I was just really lucky to be invited and to have met Bryony and to be able to experiment on that scale. But what I took from it, I had such a great response from the few pieces that had illuminations, had the light bulbs. And I came away feeling like I discovered something that I really wanted to pursue further. And so I set about making 12 new lamps, which they took probably 6 months to make. And these 12 pieces were kind of ready for a show, just at a point when Andreas Siegfrieds proposed a combined show with Anton Alvarez during London Design Week. And it just seemed like a perfect opportunity to show them. So these pieces came about and they were shown at Christie's 2017.
And there's something of the mad scientist experiment or laboratory about them. Particularly you're using is it neon, the tubing?
Neon tubing, I mean, all sorts, just regular incandescent bulbs, but also lots of model making techniques. So I looked at the tradition of like railway model making or you know, like Warhammer paints. And I just looked at how people made little environments, and combined that with my metalworking interests. You know, there's like painted bronze, there's heat bent stainless, rusted mild steel, and it kind of just all came together, like a jarring concoction, as it were.
It also makes me think of Frankenstein and the idea of giving something life through occult means. So, to me, like particularly the neon, it suggests, like, you know, old movies, science fiction also, in the sense that there's the kind of blinking animation that's coming into the work.
It was a baptism of fire. I mean, I had a limited experience with electronics. I've got a friend who's an electrician, and I really bothered the hell out of him. You know, I called him up so many times. But yeah, I have to say, the first time you've wired up the neon and you've connected it to, you know, you've got all these different bits coming up. Some of them have like various elements. And then when you finally test it and everything lights up, it's just so exhilarating. It's, you know, it's really fun.
I bet. I think you feel some of that in the work, even when you just see it, you know, not having gone through that process of building. It does have this kind of just amazing sort of whiz bang quality to it.
Yeah, thanks.
There's also, of course, the slapstick comedy in this particular project, which has again stayed with you. And I think particularly of those hot dog finger-like elements coming out of the work that we're looking at on the left. There's also maybe an element of rudeness or maybe even implied sexual imagery.
Oh yeah, definitely outrageous, ridiculous, but you know, when you I guess when I'm putting together a body of work, I will always have some that are just pushing one boundary just a little bit too far. So like the piece you say on the left, it is just outrageous, but it's also really fun and silly. And when you put it next to, because in the show it was next to something that was far more serious, and it's a bit like a Monty Python sketch. You know, it's like someone's stony cold face with another person in the background throwing a cow over a wall, or, you know, it's just totally ridiculous, but a lot of fun.
So you get a bit of John Cleese and a bit of Terry Jones in there.
Exactly.
Okay, so that leads us nicely to the gigantic slab of mortadella that is the centerpiece of your show, Fruiting Habits. So here we're now watching you come into the orbit of Friedman Benda. And this is the first exhibition that you did there, which was down in the project space, now converted to offices. I think Lucy is actually sitting where this photograph is taken.
Ah, yeah.
But back in 2018, seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? There was a space downstairs. So this was an opportunity for you to work at yet another level of ambition and kind of intensity in making the space. I wonder if you could talk first about the title, Fruiting Habits. What does that suggest to you?
I thought for a long time about what to title this show, because it was a coming together of so many different influences, and it kind of it was an expression of various ambitions of mine that, you know, new things that I'd not attempted before, but not wanting to sideline past interests that have informed the work to date. So for me, it was like it was a big mashup of things, and the title just came about in thinking of the natural world and thinking about how collectively we all have an agenda, and that is for our kind to proliferate, to stay alive, to continue, whether you're a palm tree or, you know, a wood mouse or whatever. So this title kind of reflects on that. It's just a fruiting habit is just the way in which a plant goes about procreating, and it just seemed relevant.
That's nice too, because we kind of keep coming back to this theme of the contrast, work, like the seriousness and the absurdity we were just talking about. And there's something nice there about the necessity that's implied by Darwinian evolution, and then the kind of insane, beautiful variety that actually results from that same process. So it's literally survival of the fittest, you know, change through death on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, it's, you know, it becomes this polymorphous paradisical set of natural forms that we see around us. And I feel like both of those two energies are captured in the show.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's look at some more images of it.
Mhm.
As you said, you were also trying not to lose some of the previous
Yeah.
directions. So we see the stonework is still integrated. The lighting is
Mhm.
coming back in as well. Also, you were working with wallpaper again, which you mentioned briefly. I wonder if you
Yeah.
could say a little bit about wallpaper, because that particular wall that we see in the back of this shot is a
Excuse me.
way of conditioning the space.
Yeah, it just seems to me, I know a lot of people, I know a lot of artists that feel uncomfortable about titling work. And so they'll use the untitled, they'll sometimes put things in parentheses, and it just seems to me like when you're titling a piece of work, it's or not titling it, it's a wasted opportunity. It's a moment at which you can pass on a little bit more information. And so for me, when I'm exhibiting work, I feel the same about the floor and the walls. You know, this is all an environment, and collectively it comes together to make an experience. So
Yeah.
why not put something on the walls? And why not put something on the walls that is totally jarring and excuse me, potentially like alienating for some of the artworks that are around it? I don't know. It just seems like something just not to miss. These wallpapers are made using blue back paper. It's really basic billboard stuff it's kind of outdated now. They use different technology. But what I quite like is the prints, like they never quite match up. So there's like overlaps, and like if you get up close, it breaks up and you can see the dots from the print machine. So it's got like a kind of a nostalgic element to it that, yeah, I'm quite fond of.
It's another pop art reference too, potentially, because of course it makes you think of Warhol and Liechtenstein, with Benda dots and so on.
Yeah.
So here we see a couple of the works that were included in this show, which again have this kind of lavish, lush quality to them. And I think even in the individual works, we see some of that maximalism you were just describing coming through, like not a single square inch unaddressed.
Yeah.
And they just go and go and go and go.
Yeah.
But there's also, I don't know if there's any way of answering this question really, Jonathan, but despite that maximalism and the all-inness of the work, it also always feels super tight to me. Like it really is considered all the way around. And I wonder how you, as a designer, balance that sense that you're like throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, into the work, and yet also maintain a quality of rigor.
Well, I'm pleased that you think that. That's flattering. Thank you. I think that for me, it's important, whilst I'm making an exhibition, putting all of these different pieces together, I'm also aware that, you know, something like this piece, the Tropical Suggestions, might live on somewhere, and it might go and be on its own in a place, and it will need to stand up for itself. And so I'm always conscious to take something out of the mix and just to look it over and make sure that I'm like totally confident with what it's doing, you know, or that it's got, you know, enough useless function or, you know, absurdity or color. So yeah, I guess I do think about it quite a lot.
Okay. There's also again some kind of found objecty moments, like the jar that's sitting on the stone tabletop there. So there's also a way in which the this, I suppose, it contrasts to what you were just saying, the idea of the objects going off and having their subsequent life. There's also a way in which you populated this show. We also see the bananas way back there on the back left.
Yeah.
So things kind of sitting around, which to me suggested a kind of domestic ambiance, sort of lived inness.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely wanted to suggest that. The jar on the front, it is a found jar, but inside are resin cast pickles with silicone oil. So there are, yeah, the references that you talk about, they're all food references, as if it were a lived-in space. That is what I wanted to suggest.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's move on from this project. There's a few more installation shots in case people missed it back in 2018. And these images maybe make the space look kind of big, but it wasn't. So
No.
I think it's also just worth underlining the intensity of the environment that you created. It really was like plunging into the inside of your brain. And it wasn't claustrophobic exactly, but yeah, it had that kind of intensity and sort of quality of being immersive, I suppose, partly because of the dimensionality of the space.
Yeah.
But then I wanted to ask you specifically about the series of chairs that were included in that show, because these felt like really important to me. We saw earlier in the cafe project that you did, Milk, that you had been using the steel bending technique and welding technique as a way of kind of drawing in space. But these chairs feel like a really cogent exploration of that particular method. And then also, I think anytime a designer sits down to make a chair, it's like a big thing, you know, because the chair is often going to become emblematic of the designer, maybe not so much in your case. But could you talk a little bit about this particular series and what you were achieving with it?
Yeah, so the premise for the exhibition was to make like a kind of a faux apartment. And so in there was a bed, there was a living room, and there was a dining table. And for the dining table, I had to make some chairs. And you can't have just one, you need to have a few. And the idea of trying to make the same chair 4 times in the drawing in space kind of technique that I do is just really not interesting to me. And so, you know, I acknowledged that I wanted to make 4 different chairs. And then I took it upon myself to limit the materials, but experiment in how they came together. So there's 3 types of wood. There's elm, alder, and beech. And actually, no, 4. There's oak as well. Sorry. There's bronze on each. There's an element of bronze, cast bronze. And then there's powder coated steel. And the color of the material, the color of the powder coating brings them together and unifies them. But they're all like wholly different in how they're made.
But that's interesting. It's like a Mad Libs approach where you kind of commit to the idea that there's going to be one bit of wood and one bit of bronze, and then you're going to have this particular powder coated thing giving it continuity. And then within that system, you improvise and experiment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of mix and matchingness.
Yeah, and it was really exciting. It was it's a lot of fun. It's difficult when you think, you know, if someone were to come and say to me, Jonathan, can you make another set the same? I wouldn't have anywhere near as much fun. And there's something about the exploration that's really exciting. And you know, I'm working on a set of chairs at the moment, but they'll be quite different, and they'll allow, you know, for more experimentation and exploration.
Yeah, even within each chair, there's also a sense of a kind of a chain of association that's happening. Like a lot of unexpected maneuvers happening inside each chair, even if you follow the powder coated steel around and watch it twisting and turning. It's got a very associative quality to it.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're zooming ahead to conclusion here in the present show, MelonMelonTangerine, which just opened this week, Friedman Benda. So I think here we're starting to see works that leading up to that. So we'll go a little bit quicker here. Can you talk about this latest exhibition, which is now in the big upstairs space at Friedman Benda, and how you've approached it?
Yeah, sure. So this piece is just before the show. This was one we showed in Miami. But this is of a similar vein to some of the work in the show. And it loosely documents a journey that I made with my wife, Rachel Champion, where we traveled. She was doing a residency in Nebraska, and she had to get there overland. So we just took it upon ourselves to meet in LA and then drive and pass through all of the places that I've personally dreamt about for most of my adult life, you know, going through Joshua Tree, going through the Rockies, going to, you know, we actually, you know, camped up high in the Rockies and heard bears at night and terrified ourselves. It was just an epic trip. And the show documents some points from that trip where, you know, be it like a palm tree from Joshua Tree, like a Joshua Tree from Joshua Tree, or the, you know, the cholla cacti, yeah, I mean, there's all manner of references. I'm sure to some people, and I have had, minor criticism, like they say, oh, well, I can't see the Wild West in this piece, but it's just there in the bones. It's how I felt when I was there, when I was traveling, as I was, it could be anything. It could be going into, we visited this supermarket just on the border of Utah, and it was like going back in time. The cultural references, the products on the shelves, it was just truly captivating. It's remarkable. So yeah, there's all manner of references. This is from a previous show curated by Ivona Blaswick at the of the Whitechapel Gallery, and these are 3 lamps that I made for her. But yeah, so the show is kind of a culmination of that research.
It strikes me also, Jonathan, that you're now at the point where your idiom is so highly developed that no matter where you go, you can turn it into something that looks like a Jonathan Trayte object. Like it's almost like you're an illustrator. I don't mean that your work feels like illustration, because obviously it doesn't. But it's like you have a particular style of seeing, perhaps. And it's like your work is now flipped around to becoming the lens through which you might view a landscape as different as rural England or the American West.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. It's interesting to think that, and I always like to try and challenge myself and experiment. But there's definitely go-to materials or textures that I can't help but use. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's nice to think. Yeah.
Let me ask you maybe one last big question as we're drawing to a close here, which is about the issue of escape. So obviously, it's been a rough year. We don't need to belabor that point. Everyone's very well aware of it.
Yeah.
You've been making work that in some ways continues, but also I think in some ways intensifies this idea of a kind of vacation resort cabana vibe, and also just in a more primary sense seems to give you this invitation to relax and kind of drop your shoulders and disappear into this world of kind of intense casualness, might be a good way of putting it. And I wonder if you could talk about that emotional quality in the work. Really, it's not in everything, but it's definitely there a lot.
Yeah. Well, we touched on this in the Q&A we did for the catalogue, which was really, really good. But there is a certain amount of melancholy in the work too. There's obviously, it's very vibrant and exciting. It's celebrating life in all of its weird shapes and colors, and 5-fingered palm, fir trees in France, or whatever it is that's influenced the work. But there's also, a bit of sadness, just, I guess, reflecting on our place in the world and the damage we're doing as a species, and just the amount of waste as well. I am conflicted because I use materials, I use energy intensive materials. Like, this is a painted bronze sculpture. A lot of energy has gone into making this. But I did a show a few years back, and the curator said, oh, I hope you please don't use bubble wrap when you're packing your work. I'd much rather if you didn't do that. And I'm just looking at it thinking, are you crazy? You know how much energy has gone into making the artwork. Forget the bit of bubble wrap. Jeez. So yeah, I mean, there's so many contradictions in what we do, but I have to say, I think about it a hell of a lot, and I'm also fascinated by the natural world. So it all kind of comes together in this weird mashup, this, like I say, contradictions, probably rife. But yeah.
I saw we had a question already from my co-host Stephen Burks about landscape. This might be a good time to pose it while we're looking at this object, because of course, when you think of landscape, you may immediately think of the tradition of landscape painting, which itself had a kind of escapist or fantastical quality, like Albert Bierstadt painting the American West, whatever the case may be. And I wonder how you think about that term in relation to your work, because of course you're creating objects which are also still life-like, but there's also the presence of landscape as imagery.
Definitely. So the lamps that I made early on were a reference to landscape, and I even gave a lot of them titles that referenced islands around the world that have, you know, some influence in how the piece came together or how it appeared. And these are a continuation on from that. They are, yeah, I definitely see them as landscapes. And also, I also kind of feel like there is a painterly approach in how they come together. And we touched on this in the Q&A, just how, you know, how you have to visualize some things, you know, like I've always got an idea of what materials are going to be used and how they'll be presented, but it's not until you actually put the piece together that it really comes alive. And I guess that's an advantage that a painter has, in that they get to mix the colors on the palette in real time. They see it come together, but as a sculptor, you don't always have that you know,
that opportunity. Yeah, and particularly when you're working monumentally as you are in this piece, for example, which is such an impressive and to me this is an incredible thing, the scaling up of the vocabulary into an object that you sit inside. It's almost got the kind of dimensionality that your installations did previously. It's like a world unto itself, you know.
Thank you.
But that obviously is going to come together very slowly over a lot of time in a lot of different directions.
Yeah.
The reality of it. Okay, well, let's I think I'll just show the last couple of images of works that are included in the show so people can see them. It's called MelonMelonTangerine, which sounds to me like the first line of a nonsense poem. Maybe.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
And just opened up at Friedman Benda, as I said, this week, so people can come and see it. And Jonathan's mentioned a couple of times that he and I did a Q&A that's then transcribed, so that's out there online for people to read if they like. Here's the brilliant surf candy.
Thank you.
Now, having done the show, how does it seem to you? I realize you're over in London and not actually at the show, of course.
Yeah.
But what's the measure that you make of the project now that you're a little distanced from it?
It was I won't lie, it was difficult to put it together through, I mean, in the UK we've had various lockdowns, which has meant that you can't travel. You know, I actually saw my mum 2 days ago, but I haven't seen her for 6 months prior. And you know, it's been really difficult, even getting an assistant to come and help. You know, he came down from London and we had to put him up because he had nowhere else to stay. And it was a tough year, as it has been for everyone. But also, it's been fantastic to have this to work towards, and to see it come together is just really exciting. Yeah, it's a great pleasure.
And photo credit here to Lucy, because she took these photographs this morning before we started.
2 minutes before. Yeah.
So this is up to the minute, hot off the press stuff from Design and Dialogue. Okay, Jonathan, let's take a couple of questions. We just have a little bit of time left.
Okay.
Mario Ballesteros, our colleague down in Mexico City, asks, what do you think the influence of the RCA has been on the way contemporary design is practiced and thought of today, not only in the UK, but beyond? Do you see it as a school in a larger sense, a way of thinking, practicing, learning that transcended the...
So it's an easy mistake to make. There's the Royal College of Art, and then there's the Royal Academy of Arts. And the Royal College of Art is an institution that encompasses like so many different mediums, you know, glass blowing, design, industrial design, you know, all sorts. But I studied at the Royal Academy, which is a totally different institution. It's privately funded, and there's only maybe 16 or 18 students selected each year, and they'll be across the board from photography to painting, sculpture. Less so design, but there's obviously a design influence in everything that we do. And it's a 3-year MA, so you really get to know your peers. I met my wife there and we got married. So yeah, it's going to the Royal Academy is like you're being in part of a family, a small family. It's intense, but you take away from it really great friendships, and it's been a major inspiration for me, you know, going forward. I felt very lucky to have been there.
But maybe to Mario's question, and again, a very easy mistake to make, especially if you're not in London. Do you also feel the kind of presence of the other design schools like the RCA, Central St. Martin's? Is that part of your...
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, maybe not so much like I wouldn't say that you could go to an exhibition of someone's put together, not knowing about their history or their work, and tell immediately that they've come from a certain school. But when you put a few things together and then you find out they went to the RCA and they were on the sculpture course with such and such and such and such, you're like, ah, yeah, I can see. Because like maybe each year group has a certain flavor, like a few heads come together and they start thinking a certain way. And it creates like a really exciting kind of mini movement in a way. But the Royal Academy, everyone is working with so many different materials, and there's only a few artists that it's very varied.
Okay, nice. Yeah. Just two more questions that I'll ask as we're running out of time. One is from Kayla Noble. Do you consider yourself to be an installation artist?
I would consider myself to be an artist, and I like to think that as an artist, there are no barriers. You can do whatever you want. So I wouldn't pin myself down. No.
Right. I suppose one thing that's implied by being an installation artist is that you are creating that barrierless world, though, right? And welcoming people.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
That leads to the last question, which is from Leora Honeyman, but I did want to just mention Ashwini Bhatt asked about the influence of the American West in your work, which I think we talked about, but she also does mention the funk ceramist Robert Arneson and also Ron Nagel. Ken is another person we could mention. She's a ceramic artist working in California, so that's very front and center for her. But I definitely would see a kind of link there, maybe via pop art also.
Definitely, yeah.
Let me ask the last question, which is from Laura Honeyman. I feel like you are creating fragments of a hypothetical or speculative future, or even parallel world. And although, as you say, there's melancholy, I see a sort of hope. This is a great question. Do you imagine your objects in an alternate reality? And if so, have you thought much about that world?
Oh,
so good, right?
Yeah. I guess I do think of them in an alternative reality, and that's how the show is conceived, I guess, you know, in a way. There is definitely hope. We have to have hope, right? It's it's tricky to answer that.
Great idea.
Huh?
I was just going to say it's a great idea to throw out there at the end, because the question of whether you've already made an alternate reality or you're just gesturing to one, or if you're reinscribing qualities of the reality that we all inhabit already, is one of the big unanswerables of the work, maybe, that it's kind of drifting in that headspace, all those questions.
I guess for me, the work is rooted in reality. It's a joining together of many of the things that we take for granted to create something that is absurd or fantastical or ridiculous, as a means of escapism to a certain extent, but also kind of poking fun at ourselves, you know, looking at ourselves from a distance and thinking, like, what are we even doing? Who even are we?
So maybe it's partly alternate reality and partly head shaking self-portraiture.
I'd go with that.
The species. Nice. Okay. That's brilliant. Jonathan, thank you so much. What a great conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
It's so interesting to talk to you, but also so wildly entertaining. The kind of slow burn of the ideas and the work. It's great, and congratulations on the new show, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope everyone gets a chance to see it in person. Ashwini says, thank you all for brightening